Tower of Fantasy was one of the most anticipated largest releases of 2022, but not every large release is necessarily successful. I think we've learned that a multitude of times in recent years. And while Tower of Fantasy launched globally to upwards of 4 million players on August 10th, with $34 million in total earnings within its first month, the game, a mere 4 months later, has less than 200,000 players logging in weekly, with $9 million in total earnings over the last 30 days. To put that into perspective, less than 5% of the game's initial player base are still playing just 4 months later. And the game's earnings are low enough that it does not fall within the top 10 gacha games in terms of monthly financials per month. Those are rough statistics for any game release. But why did Tower of Fantasy decline so rapidly? What triggered this mass exodus of players? Why are players not spending much money in the game? Before we answer that, I want to take a moment here to thank our patrons over on Patreon. I hope you have the greatest of luck when it comes to RNG over the next week. You all deserve it. Also, if you have a moment, follow Mrs. Stix and I over on Twitter. Tower of Fantasy is a large, open-world, free-to-play action MMO developed by Hada Studio, a subsidiary of Perfect World. Originally announced back in July 2020, the game would go on to release in China in December 2021, with a worldwide release in August 2022. When Tower of Fantasy was announced, players immediately criticized it as being a Genshin Impact copy, much like Genshin Impact was criticized as being a Breath of the Wild copy. Both absolutely warranted reactions. What players did not know at the time was that Hada drew much more than mere inspiration from other games. We'll touch on that in just a moment. Before we go any further, I want to preface this by stating that Tower of Fantasy was rushed to completion. When it released, it was evident that the game was far from being in a full functional form, and players knew this, which leads me to the days leading up to and following the early rushed release. This is specifically pertaining to the promotional material of the game. Normally, when studios release trailers for their games, they accumulate footage and then compile it themselves. When Hada did it, they claimed it was outsourced. This happened on more than one occasion, and the studio continued to project blame from themselves. This first happened when Hada was caught stealing and reusing an asset present in Honkai Impact during a trailer. Honkai, one of the most popular action gacha games around the world. They would proceed to re-release the trailer without the asset at a later date and try to brush it aside, acting as if it never happened. Not long after, they were caught stealing again. This time, it wasn't something as minor as a singular asset. This time, they plagiarized the work of another talented artist. A full-length trailer. You'll see a side-by-side comparison of this on screen right now. Honestly, they had absolutely no shame. Now, they did apologize for stealing at a later date, but what good is an apology when this is something that you've done multiple times already, and as you'll find out, continue to do even after releasing globally? Yes, these instances of theft were for the Chinese version of the game only. Thus far, shortly after launching, the first major bug was found. A player pulled for an SSR weapon and got disconnected mid-pull. When he logged back in, he noticed that he had acquired the SSR character in-game, but it wasn't physically usable. After contacting support, they chose to delete his gacha history entirely to prevent him from sharing this online. Nevertheless, he did, and players quickly found out the logic behind the bug and began to exploit it, acquiring as many SSR weapons as they wanted, fully gearing themselves over the course of the day, even as a free-to-play player. The devs found out about this and decided to issue a fix, giving players 10 free pulls as compensation. However, utilizing the same method, players began to duplicate the compensation rewards. At this point, you'd expect, typically, for the players that abused this to suffer some type of repercussion. However, the players that abused this exploit were never punished. I'm sure you can guess how upset players were with this. Ratings began a rapid decline from what was once a 4-star game. Despite being caught stealing twice and earning the criticism of Chinese players over exploits and hacking, Hada decided to escalate things a step further. Following the drama surrounding their theft, Hada wanted to counter the negative press and negative public sentiment from players. So, what did they choose to do? They hired a team to do positive PR, specifically targeting the stores that the game was available on. The PR in question would involve copying the positive reviews left on Genshin Impact. And when I say copying, I mean legitimately copy-pasting exact text from Genshin to Tower Fantasy's store pages, minus the term Genshin, leaving exclusively 5-star reviews. Not only is this an abuse of each respective store's terms of service, but it's also blatant lying and manipulation of their players. And to top it all off, stealing from Genshin Impact, the largest, most widely known, widely recognized gacha game, mobile game, and possibly game overall worldwide. Come on, my guys. Players noticed this due to the rapid increase in rating from 3 stars to over 4 stars seemingly overnight. After months of negative press and player reception, the Chinese version of Tower Fantasy was all but dead, at the lowest population that it had been at and earning less than $1 million per month. And that is when the global version released. Players were excited, the game looked beautiful, and honestly, it still does. It looked like it could potentially satiate the need for an anime MMO that we had all been waiting for. But immediately upon playing, players were met with time-gated content, being required to wait hours, days before being able to continue with their respective stories. I remember how many people were upset at this, myself included. Even now, players are upset over gating content, and while a percentage of players quit pretty quickly after learning of this, a large number of players still continued to play. This number would continue to decline from the 4 million that it was at launch down to the 100,000 that it's at now, particularly for the reasons I'm about to outline. Within the first month, the game was overrun with hackers and exploiters, hacking their suppressor far beyond what was obtainable at the time, hacking their stats so they could one-shot you in PvP, so they could one-shot monsters and even bosses in co-op dungeons, speed hacking. There were instances where they were hacking streamers and dropping them into the sky, attempting to get them killed. This happened for days, and admittedly, is still an issue that has never fully been remedied. Then Chinese players began review bombing the game because they quickly realized there was no Chinese localization in the global version of the game. Instead, they had chosen to only allow Chinese players to play the Chinese version, which again, was dead. And let's be honest here, who really wants to play on a dead server? Then players began to accuse the devs of stealing characters from other games, specifically a game that they had already stolen from. And while I can see some very, very close similarities between the two characters, that might be all it is. Probably not, given their history though. A month after releasing, they held their very first event, and players were excited. The premium currency for the event though, the Saint Quartz found in Fate Grand Order, another massive gacha game, just recolored. You have to question their ability to come up with anything original at this juncture. How difficult is it to come up with a star, you know? And before you make the claim that it's not an exact replica, yes it is. This was addressed with the studio altering the icon after being called out once again for theft. Then 2 months ago, a hack unlike any other occurred. This hack was running rampant across every server and allowed for players to directly access and delete items from your inventory. All that was required was for you to join a group with them. This meant out in the world, in dungeons, if you happened to group up with one of these hackers, you would lose everything. This happened to thousands of players and remained an issue for days before being remedied. Players couldn't play the game during that time for fear that their hard work would be lost, so they just ended up ceasing to altogether. The worst part of all these hacks, the duplication hacks, the exploits, everything was already present in the Chinese version of the game. The version of the game that had already existed for 8 months before we received it. They had time to fix these issues in the global incarnation ahead of time, but just chose not to. But that was not the nail in the coffin. All of this contributed towards the game's ultimate decline, but it is the studio's lack of faith in their title that has really driven it into the ground. There is little to no advertising done for the game in the global market at all. Across social media, you'll find advertising for Path to Nowhere, for Neural Cloud, Genshin Impact, Raid Shadow Legends, and a plethora of other gacha games. Not Tower of Fantasy though. Tower of Fantasy's community of active players has continued to decline because they're not garnering new interested players at all. Well, that and initially marketing themselves a little too aggressively as the Genshin killer. but that's another story altogether. This has led Tower of Fantasy to the state it's in currently, struggling to stay afloat. Level Infinite have such little hope for the game that they put all of their advertising budget into Nikke. But I mean, that makes sense. It did garner in a single month what Tower of Fantasy is made in 4. Now, if Tower of Fantasy isn't your thing, no problem. I got 2 videos on screen right now that might be of interest to you. A list of what I believe are the best gacha games in 2022. These are games that you can play right now and are arguably the pinnacle of the genre. And an upcoming gacha that looks very, very good.